Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Thursday. It's the weekly summary. Today is Thursday, April 3rd. I think it's April 3rd. April 3rd, 2025. Today is day 545. I thought I'd start with a summary. So much has happened in the last 24 hours. So I thought I would start with a summary of the last 24 hours and then a summary of what's happened over the last week. Last night, Wednesday, April 2nd, Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a speech essentially saying that Israel is going to seize territory and divide Gaza even further. So there was a division previously of the Netzarim corridor dividing North Gaza, and now there's a new division that's being planned. This is amid a major expansion of aerial and ground operations. I feel like we keep hearing this, an expansion of aerial and ground operations, and you wonder how it can be expanded. He said, we're shifting gears in the Gaza Strip, implying the army is seizing territory. This is a direct quote, hitting the terrorists and destroying infrastructure. This was a video that was put out last night. He said, we're also doing another thing, seizing the Merag route. This will be the second Philadelphia route, another Philadelphia route. He's referring, of course, the Philadelphia route is the south of between the Rafah border and Egypt. He said, because we're currently dividing up the strip, we're putting pressure step by step so that our hostages will be given to us. Now, according to The Guardian, a UK outlet, the Merag was a Jewish settlement that was dismantled, 16, 17 years ago. It once stood between Rafah and Han Yunis. So that name suggests this new corridor is designed to separate the two southern cities. Katz, the defense minister, made remarks also yesterday, Wednesday, saying that the Israeli army is seizing large areas of Gaza, necessitating large-scale civilian evacuations. Analysts are thinking that this indicates the intention for Israel to take permanent control of the Gaza Strip when the war comes to an end. So that's kind of the most significant news. This just happened last night. The Hostages Family Forum, which represents the captives' families, said that they were horrified to wake up this morning to the defense minister's announcement about the expansion of military operations in Gaza. They said that the Israeli government has the obligation to free all 59 hostages from captivity. Now, when they talk about 59 hostages, it's believed that there's less than 20, I believe, that are still alive. I don't have that exact number, but of the 59, the vast majority are actually the bodies of hostages. Israel continued to target the Gaza Strip overnight. 17 people were killed in Han Yunis, 15 in the north yesterday, according to officials at hospitals in the north. Nasser Hospital said 12 people were killed overnight. Officials at the Gaza European Hospital said they received 5 bodies killed in 2 separate airstrikes. The Indonesian hospital said an Israeli airstrike was on a building of the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, in the Jabalia refugee camp in the north of Gaza. They said 15 people were killed there, including 9 children and 2 women. Hundreds of Palestinians yesterday rallied against Hamas in Beit Lahia, as the militant group said that they will not allow any party to spread chaos following reports in the street of a killing of a Hamas police officer by a particular Palestinian family. Netanyahu visited Hungary yesterday, which was in violation. The ICC had an arrest warrant out for Netanyahu's arrest. Hungary was a part of the ICC. They said they're withdrawing from the ICC. I just read that this morning, so I don't have the details. Hamas and Jordan's foreign ministry criticized far-right National Security Minister Ben-Gvir. He visited Jerusalem's holiest site yesterday morning. Jordan called it a dangerous escalation, unacceptable provocation, desecration of the holiness of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia all strongly condemned Ben-Gvir's visit to Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount compound. There were demonstrations in Jerusalem with protesters calling for the government. There have been demonstrations about many, many things. One of the things is this new conscription law, which would end the exemption for ultra-Orthodox Jewish men. now who are being called to serve in the IDF. There also were crowds gathered in Nablus in the occupied West Bank. There was a funeral of a 33-year-old Palestinian man, Hamza Hamash. He was shot and killed by Israeli forces in the Israeli occupied city yesterday morning. Israeli forces also reportedly had arrests in Hebron, Tulkarem, and Nor Shams in the West Bank. Yet again, there seems to be a stalemate in terms of potential for a ceasefire. Hamas said they will not respond to Israel's counter-Gaza ceasefire proposal, according to officials yesterday. They said that they're committed to a mediator's plan instead. On March 29th, it was conveyed to mediators a counter-proposal. Israel had a counter-proposal that they have come up with in full coordination with the U.S., after Hamas had agreed to an initial proposal from mediators from Egypt and Qatar. So specifically, Hamas had agreed to a proposal that came from Egypt. The idea was that 5 hostages would be released. It would include the American-Israeli Adnan Alexander in exchange for a renewed ceasefire. Israel responded with a counterproposal demanding the release of 11 hostages, not 5, and half of the deceased hostages in exchange for just 40 days of a ceasefire. Since yesterday morning, 77 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. The UN World Food Program announced on Tuesday that 25 bakeries who are supported from their program have closed because of the shortage of flour and the unavailability of cooking gas. We're now at a month of the siege on Gaza, with such severe limitations of humanitarian assistance and food. Israeli news acknowledged that Washington, the U.S. has sent squadrons of fighter jets, stealth bombers, and large quantities of weaponry to the Middle East amid its ongoing campaign in Yemen and ahead of an ultimatum that was given by Donald Trump to Iran. I'll talk about that in a bit, over its nuclear program. Germany has called for an investigation. There's been a group of paramedics, 8 paramedics and 6 other aid workers were killed in the Gaza Strip over this past week. France's foreign ministry said yesterday that if a deal cannot be reached with Iran, then a military confrontation seems almost inevitable, and the window of an opportunity for a deal is narrowing. Thousands of Israelis protested yesterday in front of the Knesset. I was speaking about that. Some of that was about the draft for the ultra-Orthodox, but much of it also had to do with the renewal for a call for increased fighting in Gaza. Now I'll shift to a summary of the broader Middle East. Not just the broader Middle East, what happened over, the last week. That was a summary of just the last 24 hours. So Palestinians over the weekend observed the first day of Eid al-Fitr as Ramadan came to an end earlier this week. An Israeli airstrike struck tents and a home that killed 10 people, including children. 20 people were injured in that particular strike. That was in Al-Mawasi in Gaza. That was according to Han Yunis civil defense leaders. The U.S. said this last week that all parties on the ground in Gaza should comply with international humanitarian law. They added that every single thing that is happening in Gaza, this is the U.S. and the Trump administration, they said everything that's happening in Gaza is happening because of Hamas. And wounded Palestinians are dying because of the lack of medical equipment and supplies in Gaza. A U.S. surgeon said this, who's been working at 2 Gaza hospitals over the last 3 weeks. And separately, the UN World Food Program, Thursday of last week, said that bakeries will run out of flour within a week. So a week is today. And so last week, workers in Gaza from the UN World Food Program said that bakeries will run out today of flour in Gaza. Hamas militants last week tortured to death a Palestinian man who publicly criticized the group and participated in protests against Hamas. And UNICEF said on Sunday of this past weekend that at least 332 children have been reportedly killed, 609 wounded, just since the start of the renewed offensive 2 weeks ago. Lord have mercy. A UN spokesperson yesterday described as ridiculous Israel's claim that, quote, there is enough food for a long period of time, end quote, in Gaza, adding that UN aid supplies are at their tail end. Monday in Gaza, the bodies of 15 emergency and aid workers from the Red Crescent, Palestinian Civil Defense, and the UN were recovered from a mass grave in south of Gaza's Rafah, said the UN Emergency Relief Coordinator, Tom Fletcher, adding that the workers were killed by Israeli forces while trying to save lives. The Israeli military said that on March 23rd, they opened fire on a group of vehicles that included ambulances and fire trucks that approached a position without prior coordination, and that a Hamas operative and other militants were killed in the attack. Earlier in the week, it was announced that Israel will expand its ground operations to occupy 25% of Gaza over the next 2 to 3 weeks, according to a senior Israeli official who described the plan as a part of Israel's goal of maximum pressure against Hamas. On Monday, Israel's military issued extensive evacuation orders that cover most of the south of Gaza's Rafah city. The move indicates that Israel is launching increased ground operations in the area. Israel issued displacement orders for more than 140,000 Palestinians in Rafah, according to the UNRWA chief. This was widely reported over the last week. More than 140,000 Palestinians displaced. As of last Saturday, attacks in Gaza have killed at least 921 people and have wounded 2,054 others since Israel broke the ceasefire on March 18th. 921 people killed. Hamas released a video of the hostage Elkanah Bobat on Saturday. This was the second video of Elkanah. He said, you signed a deal. You got out the female soldiers, the elderly, and the young. You got everyone out. What about us? He asked. In the occupied West Bank, the IDF probe of Saturday's raid of the village of Jinba and Masafer Yatta, it resulted in 3 of 140 soldiers who conducted a raid being sent to jail. That was according to an IDF statement on Monday. And the Palestinian co-director of the Oscar-winning documentary No Other Land, he was taken into custody last week. He was released, I believe, last Tuesday. This is Hamdan Balal. He was arrested by the Israeli army. He was detained after a group of settlers in the West Bank had attacked him, according to activists and a neighbor who spoke to the Washington Post. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Scientists apologized following criticism for its failure to support detained Palestinian Oscar winner Hamdan Balal. A 22-year-old Palestinian was killed by the Israeli Defense Forces gunfire in the north of the West Bank in this past week. Netanyahu withdrew the nomination of Eli Sharvit, to be the head of the Shin Bet intelligence agency. There's been a major crisis going on. I'm going to take a minute and try to summarize it quickly. And I'm just going to actually read what the Jewish Telegraph Agency said, because it's a little bit complicated. This crisis in Israel has been called Qatargate. That's what it's called in Hebrew as well. So there's a gentleman named Eli Feldstein. He was hired after the October 7th attacks. He was hired as a spokesperson for Netanyahu. Feldstein, at the very same time, allegedly, he also was being paid to represent the Qatari government. Qatar, of course, is a longtime funder of Hamas. Hamas political operatives have lived in Qatar. Qatar is a mediator in this conflict. Qatar is viewed by some as, an honest broker, by others as an enemy of Israel. And there's been a push of Qatari messaging to Israeli journalists. So the men who oversaw Feldstein, there's a gentleman who's a longtime Netanyahu advisor whose name is Urich. He is facing similar allegations to Feldstein. This week, other accusations surfaced that Urich sent Qatari talking points as statements from Netanyahu's office. So 2 aides from Netanyahu's office this week on Monday were arrested on allegations of having financial ties between Netanyahu's office and Qatar. So this is called Qatargate. This is a huge crisis in Israel. This is another crisis. Netanyahu has not been implicated as of yet, but the question is this going to finally topple the right-wing government of Netanyahu? And so it's important to understand Feldstein, Urich, they've been arrested. The investigation has ensnared other people. Jay Footlick is a former Democratic advisor. He reportedly arranged Qatari payments to Feldstein. On Tuesday, it emerged the Jerusalem Post editor-in-chief, a guy named Klein, Zivka Klein, was also being questioned under caution in the probe. Klein visited Qatar a year ago in the country's investigation, spoke with senior officials. This is all from the Jewish Telegraph. He wrote, his trip there reveals a nation striving for a larger purpose on the world stage. Israeli media had reported that Feldstein invited Klein to Qatar. Klein denied the claim. He said, I've never met Feldstein. There's like all this. This is what Qatargate is, right? He said the Qatari government is one that contacted us, the Jerusalem Post, because they knew we're balanced, influential. That's the read among government officials and influential American Jews, as do many other countries, and we have no need for intermediaries. A day earlier, Netanyahu himself was questioned, but the prime minister has not been charged as of yesterday in Qatargate, but he was brought in for questioning on Monday. You know, as I mentioned, Qatar is viewed by many as an enemy of Israel. You can see why this is a major crisis. And this is all in the midst of protests, of escalations in the war and a new offensive in Gaza. Netanyahu Monday announced Eli Sharvit as the former head of the Israeli Navy as the new head of Shin Bet. Shin Bet is the domestic spy agency, and some are saying that the reason Netanyahu got rid of Ronan Bar, the former head, is because of this whole issue with Qatargate. So that's kind of what's going on in terms of internal Israeli politics. Following his testimony on his aide's connection to Qatar, Netanyahu said Monday that his staff members, Urich and Feldstein, are being held captive to prevent the ousting of the Shin Bet chief. And then, of course, the Hostages and Missing Families Forum decried this choice of word for captives. And they said, can we remind you, 59 of our brothers and sisters have been held in Gaza for 542 days. So that's what's going on in Israel. In Egypt, on April 1st, the President Sisi of Egypt and President Trump had a conversation. This is significant. They spoke about Gaza. This is in the context of the U.S. saying that Egypt owes the U.S. for U.S. attacks against the Houthis in Yemen. I don't know if you know, the U.S. is bombing. We're bombing the Middle East. That's the summary. We're bombing the Middle East. This is significant because they spoke about Gaza. Egypt owes the U.S. because the U.S. is attacking the Houthis in Yemen. One thought is that Egypt owes the U.S. and so they should back off the Cairo Declaration. That's the Cairo Peace Agreement. It should also be noted in that context that Trump is planning his first overseas trip. Guess where it is? It's to Saudi Arabia. So in general, Reuters laid this out. Tuesday's call, the Houthi attacks on the Red Sea shipping have cost Egypt a lot in the Suez Canal revenues. Thus, Egypt owes Trump something for these U.S. raids. I could go into more details about that. On the first day of Eid al-Fitr, there were demonstrations across Egypt in support of Gaza and against Trump's plan to displace Palestinians after the Eid prayer. There have been escalations in Lebanon. The second in 3 days, Israel struck Beirut. 3 people were killed, 7 people were injured this past week. Hezbollah said they'll have to resort to alternatives if Israeli attacks on Lebanon continue. The Lebanese state does not respond and act against them. In Iran complained to the UN Security Council for the reckless and belligerent comments by President Trump. Iran rejected his bullying on nuclear talks as threats are ratcheting up. There's a question, there always has been a question, I've talked about this weeks ago, of whether or not Israel would attack Iran or vice versa, and whether or not the US would join Israel in attacking Iran. And so that question is percolating to the surface once again. I just returned from the UAE. I met with the rabbi serving at the Abrahamic Family House there and mentioned praying alongside of him and others in the community. There was a court in the UAE that sentenced 3 people to death for the killing of the Israeli Moldovan Zvi Kogan. So the 3 people who killed the Israeli there were just sentenced to death. That happened this week. So in Syria, Israeli overnight strikes. This was just last night. 9 people were killed in Syria overnight by Israeli strikes. Dozens of people were wounded. This was in Hama in Syria. IDF said that they targeted military bases. Of course, they're supported by the US. Syria's interim president al-Shara over the weekend announced the formation of a caretaker government that would last for up to 5 years. There was an organization for the prohibition of chemical weapons. Inspectors have inspected previously unseen chemical weapon productions and storage locations by the former Assad regime. In Yemen, suspected airstrikes killed 6 people yesterday across, these are suspected US airstrikes. There's really no question, may I just say, like, they're suspected US airstrikes. 6 people were killed in Yemen yesterday. This has been going on for the last several weeks, or the last at least several days, the last 7 to 10 days. Suspected US airstrikes around the Houthi-held capital of Sana'a on Monday. At least 1 person was killed. Suspected US airstrikes pounded Yemen overnight into Saturday, killing at least 1 person. Is the US bombing of Houthis effective? There was a webinar, I'd encourage you, if you're interested, watch it, by the Middle East Institute, where Nadwa al-Daswari, an associate fellow at the think tank, said it will only slow down and not diminish the threat of the Houthis. Joseph Votel, a retired general and former commander of US Central Command, said the same conversations that the Houthis have learned a lot about protecting their assets and their resources through years of conflict. Gregory Johnson, the associate director of the Institute of Future Conflict at the U.S. Air Force Academy and a scholar on Yemen, said that Trump's maximalist vision for neutering the Houthis is foolhardy. So we could talk about the efficacy of that. Finally, in terms of the U.S., a federal judge declined the Trump administration's request to transfer the Columbia student and pro-Palestinian activist Mahmoud Khalil's immigration detention challenge to Louisiana, where he's currently being held, ruling the case should be heard in New Jersey. The Trump administration fired nearly all of the staff of the USIP on Friday of last week. Trump launched a review into the federal grants at Harvard University following allegedly failure of the university to address anti-Semitism on campus. The Senate is set to vote today on Bernie Sanders' efforts to formally block the Trump administration's $8.8 billion weapons sales to Israel. It's surely set not to succeed. The question will be the question is really the litmus test on where are Democrats in terms of their discontent with Israel's conduct in Gaza. The last time Senator Sanders brought forward similar legislation, 19 senators voted in favor, of blocking the weapons sales to Israel. And we just finished hosting last night Reverend Dr. Mother Itzhak at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church with his book, Christ in the Rubble. Where would the God of suffering be in the midst of such suffering? The Prince of Peace. And so if you missed that, I'd encourage you. That's available on our YouTube at cmep.org. Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy.